My name is Teddy D. I am one half of the hosting duo. The other half is Jonathon Lehman from the Brothers Lehman Sports Happy Hour that you can find on the Black Is Podcast Network. As of tonight, Jonathon and I had a show scheduled, but guess what? I fell asleep and I threw out the schedule, so we couldn't connect tonight, and we will be back shortly. But please, as always, go out and support he and that wonderful network at the Black Is. And he'll be back next show. So tonight, I have a special guest. I figured who better to bring on than the person that I know the majority of my political information from, the man that is my father, Mr. Dwight Sr. How are you?
Great. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Never knew I would intro my dad into a podcast. How about that? Beautiful, beautiful times, man. Beautiful times.
Yeah, it is.
All right. So tonight, before we get started on two awesome topics, I wanted to take the time and thank the people that have gone out of their way to support our network. As always, if you want to join the patrons list, please go to patreon.com/BlackAstronauts. And we want to give a shout out to V. Williams, Feeks Beard, Peter H., Pasto Chene, Felt 5, Robbie R., Deloya, Sadida H., Shlonda W., Wonga, Cameron B., Mr. Brent, shout out to Mr. Brent, OAF, Simo, Ashley G., Chonilla, Knowledge, Dre, shout out to the homies down there in Memphis, Mississippi, the greatness that is MJ, Donald, Affilio Ono, Teddy Funk, Charlie Snowflake, and Angela D. Thank you. We truly do appreciate not only yours, but any support that is given to this network. It's the reason why we can expand and do more shows. So tonight, when we decided to do the show, there were two topics that we wanted to touch on. And as always, the premise is to make this show as short as possible, as condensed as possible. So with that being said, let's start the clock. So the first one that we wanted to talk about is an issue that we've brought up before on this show, and that is the criminal justice system in general, but specifically the criminal justice reform that may or may not be going on. In politics, there's a lot of different ways to look at the system as a whole. What we want to focus on today is the macro instead of the micro view of things. So you can get lost in the weeds very easily if you want to discuss one or two topics specifically, but we want to discuss how not only the prison system is viewed, but why it is the way that it is. So with that being said, Dwight Sr., you and I spoke earlier, and you brought up a couple of interesting topics. What's the main point that you have on the issue?
Okay, about criminal justice reform. The criminal justice system is an institution, and a lot of people refer to it as the prison industrial complex. Now, when I was growing up, we had a president, Dwight Eisenhower, and his farewell address in 1961, he warned Americans to be aware of the military industrial complex, where the military had great influence throughout the economy. Today, we have something even more evil for black people. It's called the prison industrial complex. And I'd like to give you a short history of what we've experienced historically.
Okay.
Back in 1896, the Supreme Court made a ruling, a very evil ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson, which they stated that we had a separate but equal country. And that happened in 1896. That happened in the middle of something that was very terrible was going on in the South. From 1890 to 1910 is when Jim Crow started taking over the South with this evil philosophy.
So Plessy versus Ferguson was
occurred in 1896. Okay. During that period in which Jim Crow became ingrained into the fabric of the South.
Okay.
So as a result, your mother and I experienced some things as a result of that, we were born in the 50s in Birmingham, Alabama, and Jim Crow was the law of the land then. Mm-hmm. And both of our fathers worked for U.S. Steel. Mm-hmm. Now, U.S. Steel was the first billion-dollar corporation that was founded when a great financier, J.P. Morgan, he got together with Andrew Carnegie, who owned a great steel firm, and another guy named Gary, who Gary, Indiana is named after. He owned a steel firm, and one other guy, I can't think of his name. J.P. Morgan cobbled all three of those great steel companies together to create U.S. Steel.
Oh, wow. I didn't know it.
Yeah, that happened in 1901.
Okay.
And U.S. Steel became the first billion-dollar corporation.
Okay.
And in Birmingham, we had a steel company called Tennessee Coal and Iron. The initials were TC&I. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up in Birmingham, we didn't refer to the company our fathers worked for as U.S. Steel. It was TCI. So as a result of Jim Crow taking over from 1890 to 1910, black men who were totally innocent, just walking in the streets, were arrested for no reason at all in prison, and they were forced to work in the coal mine and the iron ore mines that U.S. Steel owned. They were slave labor.
Oh, wow.
So that's example. That's an example of the prison industrial complex. So that continued for many years, probably until the beginnings of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. But that's how your mother and I was affected by. My fathers worked for the company that allowed that to happen, U.S. Steel, back in the early 20th century.
So wow, U.S. Steel itself came from three separate companies. They were all part of a monopoly.
Andrew Carnegie owned one of the steel mills. As a result, when J.P. Morgan bought him out, his steel company out, J.P. Morgan became the richest man in the world. His fortune today will be worth $430 billion. He was the richest man in America. Remember, one of the richest men in the world.
That ain't bad.
Right now, Jeff Bezos, he owns Amazon. He's worth probably $120 billion. But Andrew Carnegie's wealth at the time would equal $400 billion in today's inflation rate.
So by comparison, and you're referring to Carnegie or Rockefeller?
Andrew Carnegie.
So Andrew Carnegie, by today's comparison, would be three times.
Almost four times as much as Jeff Bezos right now.
Wow. Almost four times.
Based on the inflation.
Right. Almost four times as rich as what we consider as the richest person in America right now. In the world now. Jeff Bezos is the richest person in the world.
Okay. But what I'm saying is that because of that company, TC&I, they actually aided in the discrimination and maltreatment of black men back in the early 20th century by having them work slave labor as a result of that.
Okay.
Now, your mother and I, I'm sorry.
No, that's what I wanted to follow up with you. So just to clarify, it aided by allowing the local police and different law enforcement to
actually snatch black men off the street, arrest them, and convict them for nothing they've done, put them in jail, and forcing them to work in the coal mines and the iron ore mines, and maybe in the steel mills themselves. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
But so that was part of U.S. Steel's history in Birmingham.
Okay. So Birmingham specifically?
Yeah, Birmingham used to be called the Pittsburgh of the South.
Okay.
Because it had one of the biggest steel operations in the country.
Right.
And as a result of that, one thing about that is that my father and your mother's father both worked at U.S. Steel, and even though they weren't paid nearly as much as the white employees that worked there, they still made enough money to give us a good middle class family, make us a middle class family.
So the irony, before you move on, the irony in that is, and to go on top of that, I assume that both my grandfathers worked jobs that may have been tougher than a lot of the white employees back then as well, but they were paid less. But
It still made enough money to give us a good family environment.
Right. And I was just going to make the one point and let you go on, is that you can also make the correlation between the way that the employees that were given the lower wages but can still afford to give their families a good life, although it's not the perfect comparison. Nowadays, instead of a lot of companies here based in America hiring American employees, they often take their factories overseas or to countries where instead of paying, Jim down the street $15 an hour, you can pay someone down the street in, Mexico or any other country a lower
$1.50 an hour.
Yeah, $1.50 an hour wage, but right. In that area, it still affords their family a really good life, right?
Right.
Okay. I just wanted to make that one point before you finish on, but go ahead.
Yeah, your mother and I was visiting one of our relatives, and he introduced us to a documentary on Netflix. Mm-hmm. I believe it was called The 13th. And that was really talking about the 13th Amendment, mm-hmm. how the prison industry has grown so large that a lot of prisoners are in private prisons, and people they're C corporations, the people buy stock in them, uh-huh. and the companies' profits are booming. And as a result, the stock in these companies are booming. So really, the prison industrial complex has done terrible harm to black men particularly. One thing about it is they are being sent to reform school and prisons for things like possession of marijuana, for example. Mm-hmm. And they get really strict sentences, especially with crack cocaine versus cocaine. Oh. And so as a result, they get in prison, and when they get out, they can't find a job because a lot of companies have this restriction that you can't be hired if you got a criminal record. Mm-hmm. So they're condemned. A lot of them are condemned to nothing but a life of crime because they can't find any work anywhere else. So one thing about that is we have a senator in Kentucky, Rand Paul.
Oh,
I don't agree with almost anything he does.
But
one thing I do respect him for is he is now working with a black senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, to find a way to get rid of this prison industrial complex. So I respect Rand Paul for that. That's one thing I do respect him for. He's trying to help us get rid of this great problem. It's like a plague upon the African Americans here in America.
Now, you said a whole lot right there. And before you go into an explanation or anything else, there's so much that I want to follow up, but I'm only going to ask one or two questions, and we're going to use that to segue to our second topic. So, one, we mentioned it on the show, I believe the last political show that we did, that Rand Paul is one half of the legislation with not only Cory Booker, who is a potential Democratic presidential candidate, but also with Kamala Harris of California. I agree with you in that this is one of the issues that I have tried my best to shout from the rooftop that I don't align politically with Rand Paul, but that legislation that he did was awesome. That was great. And it also points out how even two people with views that seem to be on the exact opposite of the aisle can align and work together if the motivation is there and there's a path to do so. And one of the main things that I love to see with both sides is civility and the ability to work through any minor issues to get a major result like they did in that case. Now, with that being said, Rand Paul is a libertarian candidate, I believe, and Cory Booker himself has been described as several things in his own party. Before we go on to that second topic, I'm not sure how to categorize him, but he may fall into this next category. So traditionally in politics, there has been different versions of Democrats and Republicans. For example, you can have Democrats that are extremely left-leaning, which means they're an extreme version of what you would view as a Democrat. And you also have Republicans that are extreme right-leaning, which means that they're extreme versions of what you would view as a Republican. But there's also a large number of politicians in the past that have been known as moderates. And when you say the idea of a moderate politician, today that means something that may be different than you've seen in the past. For example, one of the politicians that Tonda, my sister and your daughter, she and I always admired and liked has been John McCain. And this goes back to before John McCain ran for president. And admittedly, we weren't the world's biggest political scholars, but we did remember seeing him stand up against the Republican Party on several issues that he was passionate about. So for us, we viewed him as a moderate Republican. And an example from the left, I would say, is a candidate that eventually ran for president. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but would you consider John Kerry as a moderate?
I would think he's a more liberal politician than moderate. But you're speaking about Republican moderates. Mm-hmm. That's an endangered species right now. Mm-hmm. There are a lot less Republican moderates than there were even 10 to 15 years ago, because the Tea Party has primaried a lot of previously moderate Republican candidates from the right, and they have won elections.
Okay, now before you go on, because you're going to go deep in the woods, and I want to make sure that I get what you're saying. So when you're saying that the Tea Party has primaried the Republican candidates, you're saying that essentially,
from the right.
Yeah. So the Tea Party is the Republican Party's, and I don't want to just cast them as strictly extreme members of the right, but for the sake of this conversation, let's just say that without adding the nuance that I think is needed, but let's just not get stuck on that point. So if the Tea Party is an example of an extreme right group, they being the organization as a whole decided at one point that when moderate Republicans that had traditionally been in the Republican Party weren't to the right as much as they want, they made it a point to not only nominate candidates in local cities and states where moderate Republicans were running, but support them as much as possible, with the idea of, if this person in office, the moderate, is willing to work with the Democrats and not willing to give us exactly what we want, then we want them out of office in favor of someone who is a more extreme version of the Republican Party and our belief systems, so we can have a more partisan and a more standoffish environment in Washington, D.C. Is that fair?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the Republican Party is a lot more conservative than it was a few years ago. And as far as moderate...
But would you also say that the Democratic Party has suffered the same fate, or even a similar fate? Because my opinion is, while I do think that the Tea Party was the initial response of extreme party politics, if you will, at least recently, that the left, the Democrats, have a version of it that may not be as overtly the politics may not be as overtly obvious that they are extremely left leaning, but there's also a side to the Dems that have become more left leaning.
That's true. That's true.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, as far as moderate Republicans are concerned, the regular members of the Republican Party call moderate Republicans rhinos, which means that Republicans in name only. That's the nickname they attached to moderate Republicans.
Okay.
And
wait. So you're saying like, wow. How did I never hear that term before? They call them rhinos?
Rhinos means Republican in name only. That's the name that the Tea Party, the right-wingers, have attached to Republicans who don't feel the same as they do about issues.
So the Republicans are basically calling moderate Republicans muggles, if that's a Harry Potter.
Rhinos. Oh yeah, I guess so. I don't. Yeah. See, I don't know a whole lot about Harry Potter.
Yeah, that's a Harry Potter reference, Dad.
That's you and your sister's expertise, but I think I remember hearing her say something about those
right.
characters.
But go ahead. I'm sorry to belabor your point. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so that's the name that the Tea Party guys and the right wingers have given to moderate Republicans, and there's a lot less moderate Republicans than it used to be because primarily they've been primaried from the right by the Tea Party. And they lost because the Republican Party as a whole is going more conservative than it used to be. And this tax bill that was passed.
Real quick, in context, the tax bill you're referring to is literally the tax bill that was just passed by the Republican Party, led by the Senate, Congress, as well as signed into, or approved by Donald Trump. And that is a tax bill that we'll get into in detail later, but the short explanation of that tax bill is that, well, I there's too much to really do, but just know that it favors businesses and it will, if not immediately, but eventually hurt a lot of lower class and middle class families. But go ahead.
And it's also going to hurt the very few remaining moderate Republicans there are, because most of those guys are in states like Pennsylvania, Northeast areas, where the tax bill is going to increase federal taxes for a lot of the coastal states in the Northeast and also on the West Coast also because of the limitations they have on deductions for mortgages and state and local taxes. So a lot of those guys are going to be hurt by, they're going to be primary from the right because their constituents are going to lose money by paying more taxes because of the tax bill.
Wow. So not only is it lowering the tax bill to businesses and for the wealthy, but it's also helping not only the Tea Party, but a lot of people that want to see moderate Republicans out of office.
Right, because they're rhinos.
Yeah. And it's helping get the quote, well, see, I'm not going to use that because that sounds like a derogatory term, like I'm saying the N-word. But like,
yeah, but that's what Tea Parties call them. Okay.
Okay. But it's helping further their agenda because it is getting more moderates out of office, which theoretically can then be replaced by even more extreme thinking people on not only the right, but I don't know how this would actually go into play in this point towards the left. You know?
Actually, what it's going to do is going to elect more Democrats to those coastal states because they're going to be, these Republicans are going to be primary from the right, and then Democrats have a better chance of winning those elections.
Wow. I mean, there's, but okay, yeah, but doesn't it sound like they're almost eating their own young? You know what I mean?
They don't. A lot of times it seems that they don't think through what they're doing. You know, it's irrational behavior. I think in a lot of cases.
Okay. Wow, that is a lot, man. That was awesome. We didn't even talk about this beforehand. I didn't even know you had this that depth of knowledge. That's awesome, Dad. So Yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate you coming on, and that has been a really good way to talk about the two topics that we brought up today, which is criminal justice reform and the history of why the prison system traditionally has negatively affected not only African American men but African Americans' families and of course women. I certainly don't want anyone to hear this and feel as if it's only men that were affected negatively. African American people as well as minorities, in order to serve a greater purpose of funding a lot of different projects throughout the country. And allow me to rebut anyone who has anything to say right away. That is not the sole reason that so many people were arrested. There was also just flat out racism. Don't forget about that. That's a beast.
Right.
There were horrible laws. There was bad policing. There was a lot of traditional issues, and some of which not only apply today, but they've evolved into even more complex problems, which has really had a negative effect on the community. But that was the first topic, criminal justice reform, and then we tied that into the second, which is the concept of a moderate politician. And we spent a bulk of the time on moderate Republicans, but there's also moderate Democrats that I would love to get into. All that means is that you have to come back on the show another time.
Anytime. I'll be glad to.
So I know that the people can find you anywhere on Twitter. If you don't mind, where can the people follow your page on Twitter, sir?
Just Dwight Drinkard on the Twitter. That's where I can be found. And also, I'm on LinkedIn also.
Okay.
Dwight Drinkard on LinkedIn.
Outstanding. Well, man, I appreciate it. I love you, man, and you did great. So I appreciate you coming on again. As I mentioned, family, next show for this politics show. Two things. One, we're still in the process of switching the name, and thank you to everyone who's made some awesome suggestions. I've received all of them, and Jonathon and I will be pulling the trigger pretty soon and updating that. But just know that it's not gone unheard or unseen. So thank you, legitimately. Of course, there's a lot of people I can thank, but specifically, I'm not sure if he wants his first name out there, but my buddy we do it for hip hop. the one that gave me the nickname Lucky B. Shout out to you specifically. Thank you, sir. So as always, family, thank you. And next time we will do our best to try to bring to you two more topics from the great city of Louisville in the not so great state of Kentucky. Now that you're woke, what you gonna do? Peace.